So since we are in Switzerland, we are starting everything on time. So welcome to WMO and welcome to this IPCC Climate COP event that is kindly organized by my friend Simon from UK mission. And despite of the ongoing war in Ukraine, this is the issue that we are talking about today. Is going to be a long-term challenge for mankind, and it's also important to concentrate on this matter. And first, I would like to congratulate also the UK government for very successful COP26 at the UN level. We regard it as the second most successful COP after Paris. Sorry. But we were able to achieve a lot there, and the work continues, and we are heading towards Sharm el-Sheikh, and we hope that the good things that happened in Glasgow will be continued in Sharm el-Sheikh. With these words, welcome again, and I'd like to give floor to Simon.
Well, first of all, a very warm welcome for us, Professor Secretary General, for hosting us here today. Thank you for your cooperation. Thank you for your very warm words about COP26 in Glasgow, which are really destined, I think, for the gentleman to my left, Archie Young, and to Alex Sharma, who's going to join us on video in a second, but also, frankly, to everybody who was a part of it in Glasgow. The governments, civil society, business, everybody who came together with that sense of shared ambition and collaboration. We know we have so much more to do. And you're right, of course, to remind us that we have seen over the last 10 days now the unfolding of an extraordinary human tragedy in Ukraine and most egregious violations of international law. And it's all too easy, I think, when faced with an event of that magnitude and the severity for the international community, to lose sight of the other challenges that we face, whether they are other situations of concern like Afghanistan, or an issue of such overriding importance like climate change. And so I'm delighted that we can be here today. I'm delighted that you've been able to provide us with this rather magnificent facility here. And I'd like to thank too the Geneva Environment Network for the support that they have offered us in organising both this event and indeed the other work that we're trying to do here in Geneva to ensure that we build on Glasgow, that we work from the kind of the ambitions and aspirations of Glasgow and indeed Paris before it to realise those ambitions, and indeed to go even further and faster to ensure that we can keep climate change to within the 1.5 degree target. This event today is obviously in particular about the report produced by the IPCC, which of course is here, on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. And I'm delighted that we have such a kind of distinguished group of speakers with us today to look at that report, to consider the conclusions from it, and to think about how we work together collaboratively, ambitiously, to respond to its frankly pretty alarming conclusions. And I think even amidst the horrors of the last 10 days, that report has stood out for the clarity of its conclusions. So we're going to start with hearing from the co-chair of the IPCC's Working Group 2, and then we're going to hear a video message, as I said, from Alex Sharma, the COP26 president, and then we're going to move back, everybody, to a panel discussion, so we can hear from our speakers and how we think, say, collaboratively, we can take this report forward. And then we're going to have time, I hope, for some interventions and for some questions and answers. And for those, many of you who are joining online, please do use the WebEx features to submit your questions or your comments. And as you do so, if you kind of leave your name and organisation in your message, then we'll try and be able to come back to you by name or organisation in due course. So thanks again, everybody, for being here, whether it is here in sunny Geneva or online. And with no further ado, I'd like to invite the co-chair of Working Group 2, the IPCC, Professor Deborah Roberts to brief us on the top-line findings from their report. Deborah, the floor's yours.
Super, thank you so much. And firstly, many thanks to everyone involved in this particular session for the invitation to introduce this important discussion on our recently released Working Group 2 report. It's very much appreciated. Also, apologies, I'm kind of between venues. So I'm in an area of high construction at the moment. So if you hear some crashing and banging, that's not me. It's just the environment that I'm in currently. So let me kick off with a couple of words to set the scene for the discussions that our panelists will have. And apologies, I will need to move to another meeting shortly after providing these opening statements. I think for me personally, the most important aspect of the IPCC's Working Group 2 report is that it makes us take a really honest look at ourselves as a species in the mirror. And when we do that, we see a species which, in the words of the United Nations Secretary General, has, as a result of climate change, clobbered the planet, the ecosystems that support our lives and livelihoods, and rather short-sightedly clobbered ourselves and the infrastructure we depend on, really making existing socioeconomic development challenges far worse, especially for the poor and vulnerable. Make no mistake, this report from the IPCC pulls no punches. It makes it very clear that the scientific evidence is now unequivocal. There can be no dispute that climate change is a threat both to human well-being and the health of the planet. It also puts out a very clear SOS call to the public sector at all levels, private sector in all of its diversity, and civil society, that we only have a very brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to act. We have to realize that the point of no return is now within sight and potentially just around the corner. The report shows that there isn't a region of the world that is not already impacted by climate change, with widespread deterioration of ecosystems, increasing losses and damages, and the poor and vulnerable communities being most affected. In some cases, the change is already irreversible. And even if we only temporarily exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming for several decades, we can expect species extinctions and losses of entire ecosystems, such as mountaintops, tropical coral reefs, and coastal wetlands. Beyond 1.5, we can expect a future of increasing heat stress, water scarcity, food insecurity, flood risk, disease, and increasing mental health challenges. Our adaptation responses also do not match these challenges, according to our assessment. It is clear that our current adaptation options are entirely insufficient. The progress has been uneven, and the action taken far too slow. We have a significant implementation gap. Adaptation financing flows are also insufficient to tackle the challenges, and the funds are often not being spent where they are most needed. For example, informal settlements, which are a particular focus of this assessment. Also, adaptation cannot prevent all losses and damages, be they economic or non-economic. And as temperatures increase, both hard and soft adaptation limits will be reached. Maladaptation can make things even worse by deepening existing inequities and leading to adverse outcomes. We are simply not on track for a climate resilient world. So how do we stop this window of opportunity slamming in our collective face? A move towards more climate resilient development would be facilitated by reducing climate risks through enhanced adaptation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions through ambitious mitigation, and together achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Actions that involve all levels of governance and address inequity, inequality, injustice, and empower people will greatly enhance our resilience. The report also points to the fact that cities, while posing several challenges, for example, we'll have about 1 billion people living in low-lying cities by the sea and on small islands by the middle of the century, cities offer a global scale but time-limited opportunity to advance climate-resilient development, this integrated mix of mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development, as does the conservation and restoration of ecosystems. These are two areas of potential action that can deliver sustainability bang for the climate buck. But we should not underestimate the difficulties that lie ahead. Achieving climate resilient development is already challenging at the current global warming level of 1.1 degrees Celsius. But the prospects will become further limited if warming exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius, and simply may not be possible if warming exceeds 2 degrees Celsius. There is no doubt that international cooperation, political will, and scaled up investment is key, which is why today's event is so important. The science is really clear. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss the brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable future. This Working Group 2 report offers solutions to the world and a solutions framework in the form of climate resilient development. Certainly urge everyone to read it and to help stop the window firmly and permanently shutting in our faces and in the faces of future generations. The way forward is really to help people around the world to live sustainably and with dignity and in harmony with the planet that supports our lives and livelihoods. Thank you very much.
Deborah, thank you very much, and thank you, I think it's the right word, but look, the clarity of your message, the starkness of your warning should be a wake-up call for us all, but thank you for setting that out so very clearly for us all. Obviously, both our COP26 presidency and the Egyptian COP27 presidency to come are as focused as we can be on meeting the gravity of the challenge that you've set out for us. So for reflection from us first, I think this is the moment when, if the IT provides, we will hear from the president of the COP26, Alok Sharma.
It's a pleasure to speak to you today alongside our Egyptian partners, the COP27 presidency. For the past 2 years, I've been calling for greater attention to be given to adaptation. And the IPCC's recent report is a stark illustration of why that is urgently needed. And the report is a fierce indictment of the world's failure to take sufficient action on both mitigation and adaptation. And it's a terrible warning of what we will unleash if we do not step up now. The impacts of climate change are coming faster and more fiercely than predicted. And the report shows all too clearly what we have already lost. Adaptation, we are told, is reaching its limits. Ecosystems have been irreversibly damaged, and half of humanity is already highly vulnerable to climate change. This is not something that affects other people. It is a threat to every nation and every person on Earth. Hazards traverse borders, they compound one another, and they cut across different sectors of the economy. And unless we act collectively, the IPCC is clear, within our lifetimes, the impacts will grow in force and ferocity to terrifying levels. But we have a choice here. That is another clear message from the report. The future is not yet written. The change that comes about is within our control. We know how to build a more climate resilient society, how to protect people, economies, and ecosystems, but we must act faster to close the gap between need and action. We have the framework, the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and now the Glasgow Climate Pact, which we agreed at COP26. And that pact emphasizes the urgency of scaling up adaptation action and support. It urges parties to further integrate adaptation to local and national and regional planning, and it urges developed countries to double climate finance for adaptation from 2019 levels by 2025. And at COP26, we also launched the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work programme to deliver on the global goal on adaptation. Now, of course, one of the key things we can do to protect people and nature from the impact of climate change is to limit the rise in global temperature. We know that as temperatures rise, impacts become more brutal and adaptation becomes even harder. The IPCC is clear on the vital importance of limiting the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees. And if we honour the Glasgow Climate Pact, we can keep that goal alive. The Pact requests countries to revisit and strengthen their 2030 emissions reduction targets, or NDCs, this year, as necessary to align with the Paris Agreement temperature goal. And it calls on them to phase down coal power and phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. But even with a 1.5 degree temperature rise, adaptation will have its limits. Frankly, it's reached limits now. So whilst we adapt to the impacts that we know are coming, we must also deal with loss and damage. Again, the Glasgow Climate Pact makes real progress here. It takes important steps on loss and damage, including a process to ensure technical support through the Santiago network, and it establishes the Glasgow Dialogue to discuss funding arrangements. Together, these commitments in Glasgow are historic, but at the moment they're just words on a page. So my absolute priority for this year is delivery. We must turn commitments into action. And working with our Egyptian partners, we want to make real progress on each of the key commitments on adaptation and loss and damage. We need all countries to deliver on the Glasgow Climate Pact and turn commitments into concrete plans and action. So we're working with donor countries towards a commitment to double adaptation finance, and with all parties to make progress towards the global goal on adaptation. And we will work with the international community to ensure that the Glasgow Dialogue results in practical progress to increase funding for loss and damage and access to it. And by COP27, together, we must have developed a clear proposal and funding for the Santiago network. So I urge all the countries with us today to join us in these efforts, because failure, my friends, to act now is simply inexcusable. The science is clear. We know what we've lost. We know what's coming. We know that the window of opportunity to act is closing fast. Inaction is not an option. We cannot fail to prepare. We must deliver, and we must honour the Glasgow Climate Pact, building a safer, more prosperous and more sustainable world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Archie Young was our chief negotiator in Glasgow, working alongside Alex Sharma. When you listen both to Alex Sharma's words and to Deborah Roberts' words before, and you read the report, Archie, what do you think should be our focus as we move from that sense of ambition in Glasgow to kind of practical delivery now? To what extent do we need to kind of to change the focus from Glasgow?
Thank you, Simon, and thank you to the WMO and everybody here for this event and for really putting the spotlight on these issues, and particularly given the current global context. And I'd like to echo your remarks in terms of the situation in Ukraine. But that's why it's particularly pleasing that we are able to keep this focus on these long-term, well, I say long-term, but actually, as the report shows, sometimes very short-term, very immediate risks, hazards that we are all facing, and that it's very clear are also impacting the most vulnerable around the world the hardest. So I think in that respect, what we need to do is maintain that absolute focus on the human element of this and on the technical element, but grounded in the science. And that's why I'm pleased that we started today with Deborah, and that this conversation can then be grounded in the work of the IPCC. It's also where we tried to start the work on the Glasgow Climate Pact. So you'll notice that the very first section of that is on science. And I was in a meeting not so long ago where a colleague from the UN said that of all the great commitments that were made in Glasgow, actually potentially one of the longest standing elements that we might have delivered for the international community is making sure that science comes first and welcoming the work of the IPCC. I remember some discussions in 2018 where that was not possible, and that was very challenging. So welcoming the report of the IPCC. The Pact even expresses alarm and utmost concern at the situation, and it invites the IPCC to present the findings of Working Group 2 to COP27. And I know that our Egyptian partners, who we'll hear from today, they have firmly said that adaptation and finance loss and damage are absolute priorities for them, as they were for Glasgow and as they will continue to be for the world, because these are problems that will remain. Alok Sharma gave a very good list of some of what was achieved in Glasgow in terms of tackling these issues, whether that was the commitment from donor countries to double adaptation funding or the tripling of the adaptation fund, the Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage, the work on the Santiago network. All of these are important, but all of those need to be followed through. And that's not just making sure that the money actually comes out the door, it's also making sure the money goes where it's needed most. Locally led adaptation that really involves and engages the communities where it is needed most. And your question talked about some of where do we need to focus. Some of that is already happening through programs such as Life AR. Some of that needs real reform of some of the programs that we're all engaged with and some of the systems that we work with to make sure that the people who are being hit the hardest are able to receive the support that they need. We also recognize, of course, that Glasgow did not, on some of these issues, meet everybody's expectations. So there remains a lot of work to be done in the very capable hands of our Egyptian partners to really drive forward the work, to make sure that the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation actually leads to some real tangible difference in terms of adaptation actions around the world. To make sure that the Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage means that we can step up the funding and the action to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. So all of that is, I think, homework that we have given ourselves. One of the reasons I'm here in Geneva and pleased to be here today is to demonstrate the UK's continued focus on that and to make sure that the esteemed organisations on this panel are absolutely on board with that continued focus. Because this is not the work of one country or one organisation. This is the work of all of us together, joining up some of our pet projects and making sure that we use the best expertise, that we ground it in scientific basis, and that we aim for both continuing to push for more ambition, but also really accelerate the implementation that's so vitally necessary.
Thank you very much, Archie, for putting it so succinctly as well. And we'll obviously come back to some of these questions as we kind of move to the discussion and the Q&A as well. I'm now going to pass the floor, I hope, to the Ambassador Wael Mabad, who's the Special Representative of the COP27, President-elect, to give Egypt's perspective on all this and what our kind of co-hosts are considering as they look at this, learning the lessons from COP26 and looking at how the COP27 presidency is going to be using the IPCC reports in Sharm el-Sheikh to catalyse what we all hope will be further action to tackle the climate crisis. Ambassador, over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thanks, of course, to everyone contributing to the organization of this very important and very timely event. I wish I could be as succinct and precise as my good friend Archie Young has been. I have a lot of points to make, but I'll make some general remarks first and then move on to make a few points on the very, very important and timely IPCC Working Group 2 report. First and foremost, I can subscribe fully to all the remarks made earlier by, of course, COP26 President Alok Sharma as to the successes and the outcomes in Glasgow, and the acknowledgement that much more work needs to be done, particularly on the implementation side. We all have been contributing to the works of the UNFCCC process for the past number of years, and we've succeeded in Glasgow, and before that, throughout the years in completing the Paris Agreement work program. But we as incoming COP27 presidency have stressed implementation. We have concluded most of the negotiating work, but the expectation now from everyone is to see tangible, impactful work on the ground. I also concur with I dare say all of the remarks made by my good friend Archie Young as to the priority being given by many to the issues of adaptation, and that's why we have been looking very carefully at the IPCC report and how we can take it forward within the UNFCCC process to ensure that the foundation of all of our work. And this is something incoming COP President-designate Sama Shukri has been stressing everywhere. All of our work must be based on fact and on science. And no more reliable science than that coming from the IPCC, particularly in this very important report. Few points regarding the report and how we hope that we can catalyze further action within the UNFCCC process, based again on the science provided to us very ably by Deborah and her co-chair and the rest of the members of the IPCC who tirelessly worked on producing this invaluable report. It's worth noting that the report concludes that climate change has already caused substantial damage and increasingly irreversible losses in terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, and open ocean marine ecosystems. Where climate change impacts intersect with areas of high vulnerability, it is contributing to humanitarian crises and increasingly driving displacement. The increasing weather and climate extreme events have exposed millions of people to acute food insecurity and reduced water security, with the most significant impacts seen in parts of Africa, Asia, Central and South America, small islands, and the Arctic. Here, I need to recall the several very important Unep adaptation gap reports, the United Nations Environment Program gap reports, which demonstrate and quantify the actual adaptation needs of developing countries. The Unep report estimates that adaptation costs in developing countries to be at US $70 billion annually, and expected to reach up to $300 billion by 2030 and $500 billion in 2050, with the actual cost most likely being significantly higher than those estimates. This is further confirmed by the IPCC Working Group 2 report, and I quote, "An overwhelming majority of global climate finance has so far been targeted at climate change mitigation. The current public and private financial flows to adaptation are much smaller than needed." The report further states with high confidence that only 4 to 8% of climate finance has actually gone to adaptation efforts in recent years. The pledge, of course, mentioned by Archie and Alok to double adaptation finance in Glasgow from 2019 levels is definitely a very important step in the right direction. It, however, still, as anyone would acknowledge, falls short from actual needs. And at COP27, the world is anticipating bolder commitments informed by the IPCC Working Group 2 findings to level up and upscale finance for adaptation beyond doubling, with a clear delivery plan, simplified access modalities, and through instruments that do not drive further debt. And while we appreciate that these needs cannot be met through public finance from developed countries alone, we need to see how public finance can unlock and de-risk private investments in adaptation projects in developing countries. This requires creativity and innovative approaches to finance, but even more, it requires demonstration of goodwill by all to operationalize equity, justice, CBDR, and leaving no one behind to suffer irreversible impacts. Going forward through this decade of implementation, the COP27 presidency believes in the centrality of the role of the UNFCCC to address the adaptation fragmentation and the implementation gap at a global level. Parties at COP26 have successfully established the key processes that allow for this to progress through the Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the GGA and the deliberations on the collective quantified finance goal. As incoming presidency, we commit ourselves to facilitate a party-driven process aimed at defining and achieving the global goal on adaptation to ensure an adequate adaptation response in light of current mitigation ambition and, of course, informed by the IPCC recent findings. We heard parties loud and clear in the HODS consultations, which I co-chair with Archie, held in February on the urgency of implementation. And we are taking this to heart, and we will move forward and respond with a clear focus on all aspects of implementation. To conclude, dear Ambassador, allow me to stress that we in Egypt, as incoming COP27 presidency, have reiterated in almost all of our pronouncements that we can only collectively succeed in dealing with the challenges of climate change if we develop and nurture a sense of trust and mutual understanding amongst all parties. Many others have repeatedly stressed that we are all in the same boat, to the extent that it has almost become a cliche. Yet allow me to recall it once again. because in our view, success depends on every party feeling and believing and seeing that their interests and priorities are taken on board. No one should feel abandoned or left behind. This requires that we listen carefully to each other and at least try to empathize with the concerns and challenges of others. Conversely, achieving the progress we all seek in the absence of empathy and understanding will be extremely difficult. We must all remember that our multilateral climate change regime is a fragile one. The Paris Agreement is a bottom-up agreement highly dependent on buy-in of all parties for its success and their genuine commitment and willingness to contribute in good faith to the global effort. This buy-in will be jeopardized if countries in the global south, in particular, feel that their adaptation needs are being sidelined or that they are being called upon to carry a heavier burden in the emissions reduction effort while not providing them with the assurances they need that climate finance will be available and accessible to assist them in delivering on their contributions to the global effort. In conclusion, allow me once again to thank you for this very important, timely event, and to thank the IPCC for their invaluable report, which I hope will be the basis for moving forward as we lay the ground for more ambitious, impactful, and transformative adaptation action in Sharm el-Sheikh. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, thank you very much indeed, not least for your kind of focus on ensuring the engagement by all parties with the process as we move it forward from Glasgow to Sharm el-Sheikh. Thank you. So I'm now going to turn to the gentleman to my left, to the Secretary General of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Jagan, the floor is yours. How can the humanitarian community kind of step up to the plate in this area?
Thank you, Simon, and thank you so much also, my friend from WMO, hosting us here in this beautiful hall. And it's really good to see also finally people in the room and being able to talk to people, not to the screens. It's just so fantastic. As we heard from the speakers earlier, in many ways, the IPCC report was not a surprise to us. I think we have been hearing this from our communities, our volunteers on the ground, the countries who have been affected and who have been listening to big talks globally, but haven't seen real action on the ground for far too long. So in many ways, this doesn't come as a surprise. But what it does is it validates what we have been hearing. It validates with concrete science. I hope after this report, all the doubters now have no reason to doubt, or at least I think there is a solid scientific basis behind what we have been hearing and what we have been feeling before. So from that point of view, I really value the findings and outcome of this IPCC report. As again, we heard from Archie before and from a number of other speakers. Of course, these reports are as good as the action that follows. And I think one of the frustrations we hear from the activists, but also the people living on some of these mostly very highly vulnerable communities, is lack of action. So how do we turn some of these findings, the science, the commitments, to something, concrete action on the ground that changes the reality? And far too long, and far too many people haven't felt that. This doesn't mean to say that nothing is happening. A lot is happening, but not at the scale that's required to make a difference. So what we are doing as a membership organization, you know, we are present in 192 countries, more than 14 million volunteers working at the community level. What we are really trying to do is, of course, use our own experience and knowledge, but also the findings from the report, like this one, to try to change the action at the local level, at the community level. So we have been working to mobilize our membership to reach roughly 250 million people by 2025 with the locally led climate action on the ground. And that would be locally led. That will connect to the work that's being done by the local authorities and the national government. That will link to the global commitments that's coming out from Glasgow and many other forums. But that will focus on locally led action and action on the ground. So those would be, of course, focusing on resilience, climate resilience work, There will be adaptation work, but also that will be anticipated actions to really make a difference in people's lives. In parallel, we are also committed to, of course, change our own organizational practices. All our programs, all our behavior, all our offices, all our logistics, all our fleets also needs to adapt to that. It's not good to lecture others, but we also have to change ourselves. And some of the work has started, and again, our commitment to also to change ourselves as an organization and our behavior. So that's sort of the first action on the ground, trying to reach 200 million people, mobilizing our volunteer network of 14 million in 192 countries. The second, and which I think many of you know, and we have been working with, of course, our Red Cross, Red Crescent movement partners, but also many other organizations, including a number of UN agencies and NGOs, was to come up with the Climate and Environmental Charter late last year. And the idea behind that was, of course, to rally the humanitarian sector around something, and hopefully trying to get much more coordinated and integrated response to this crisis. I'm really pleased that in less than a year, we have more than 220 organizations who have signed up to this charter now. I'm also pleased that although originally it was not intended for the government to sign, we have at least 3 governments who have the Switzerland, Norway, and the United States have signed as a support to really promote this climate charter. And we are really hoping that this charter, of course, charter in itself is not a big achievement, but if it rallies the humanitarian sector together, I think we should be able to make an impact, because the humanitarians do have a capacity to make an impact on the climate. And the third point I want to highlight, and I'm so pleased, Simon, that you are hosting this event here today, and I know there have been many other events happening. The one gap we felt was the gap between the 2 COP events. So we have the big events, we bring 30,000, 35,000 people, and we wait for another big event to happen, and we bring another 30, 35,000 people. And a lot of times, in between those events, not enough happens. And it's extremely important that, I was in Glasgow, and in some way, I felt one part of the Glasgow where people were really, very enthusiastic and, sometimes shouting and sloganeering. And there was another part where people are having a serious negotiation. And I don't know how much of that connection was there. And I think events like this actually helps the negotiators before they reach the negotiating table. And they would have heard and listened to the voices of the communities and the people who are affected. So keeping these dialogues alive from now Glasgow to Egypt is very, very important. And we want to be part of that. I'm very happy to be here. We are also hosting an event, and I think it was 25th of March with the Egyptian and UK missions here in Geneva, titled Climate Science Humanitarian Dialogue. The purpose of this dialogue is, again, to really keep the dialogue going on and hopefully bringing the voice from the Geneva community, building on what we are discussing today, to influence the outcome in COP27. So I just wanted to highlight these 3 things to ensure the action, to ensure action in between big events, and of course, rallying and mobilizing the humanitarian community around the climate charter. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Darren, for setting that out so clearly and, as ever, so passionately. And your charter, I know, has been an inspiration to many across the humanitarian community, and, as you say, to increasing number of member states as well, including ourselves, thinking about it. Now, Archie kind of mentioned at the beginning how important kind of science was in Glasgow as a driver and a framer for the Glasgow Climate Pact. So I was going to turn now to the gentleman to my right, to our host here, Professor Talas, the Secretary General, to say a word about kind of how you see moving forward, armed now with this latest report, but also all the work we did both in Glasgow and the lead up to it. How can we use the sort of the data that you and others are constantly producing to form a spur to action, but also to frame that action in the most effective way to deliver on those commitments and that ambition from Glasgow and Paris?
Thank you, Simon. And it's also for me great pleasure to see live people in the room. So it's since 2 years we have only seen people behind the screens, and this is something quite unique. So thanks for coming. And of course, today we are talking about the major challenge for the welfare of mankind, although today our thoughts may be very much with the suffering of Ukrainian people. And despite of that, I'm grateful that the UK mission and you, Simon, decided to organize this event. And as I already said, we regard at the UN level Glasgow as the second most successful COP meeting so far. Of course, Paris was a groundbreaking one, but at Glasgow we were able to achieve, I would say, 80% of the goals. So we are not fully yet there. We are not on the track towards 1.5 degrees nor 2 degrees, but we got very positive pledges from G7 countries and European Union. And now the challenge is how to see something similar happening at the G20, remaining G20 country level, and that's a challenge for the next presidency and perhaps also the presidency of Arab Emirates thereafter. We heard very strong messages from the heads of state in Glasgow, which is positive, and I think that there has been also mental change among the governments. And we got also plenty of new governments on board, recognizing this problem and showing interest to be part of the solution. But as I said, we are not yet heading towards the Paris limits. We may be heading towards something like 2.5 to 3 degrees range at the moment, which is already positive. If you read the 2014 IPCC report, then we were talking about 3 to 5 degrees by the end of this century. So something has already happened, and already 32 countries have been able to reduce their emissions during the past 15 years, and UK is number 2 on the list. So Denmark has done the most, but positive things are also happening. And now the question is how to enhance the ambition level at all of these G20 countries. These G7 and European Union, they are responsible for 1/3 of the emissions, and almost half of the emissions are coming from the rest of the G20, and there's space to enhance the ambition level. And also it's a question whether this G7 could do something further. And of course, these most recent IPCC reports and WMO reports, they have been well recognized, and the messages are very clear. 40% of the population worldwide, they have been facing major natural disaster during the past 20 years. 2 billion have been facing flooding event, 1.5 billion drought event, and 700 million severe tropical storm event. And we have recently been breaking again records in the Arctic, 38 degrees, southern Italy 48.8 degrees, and in Western Canada 49.4 degrees, and they are all record ones. And quite often we have seen also forest fires related to those events. And besides climate mitigation, it's also important to pay attention to population growth. If it would only be 1 billion on this planet, we wouldn't have a climate change problem. And also urbanization is making this challenge even more urgent, which was also shown by the IPCC report. And they were identifying 127 risks in economy, health, ecosystems, infrastructures, and so forth. And many of them are not so much related to temperature. We are very much talking about global warming, but it's very much related to water issues. It's flooding, droughts, melting of glaciers, which are very important. And that's why we have started paying attention to water climate nexus, and together with my colleague Mami, we have established the Center for Excellence on Disasters and Climate Change here in the building. We are happy to host them in the second floor of this building. And we should keep in mind that this negative trend in climate will continue for the coming decades anyhow, and that means that that we have to pay attention to adaptation. And we have already broken this 400 ppm level of carbon dioxide, which means that the melting of glaciers and sea level rise will continue for the coming centuries. Last time when we broke this 400 ppm level, sea level was 10 to 20 meters higher than today. So it's not very good news for London, for example. So it was already said by many of you that we have to pay attention to adaptation besides mitigation. And from our perspective, investments in early warning services is a very powerful way to adapt to climate change. Only half of the 193 members of WMO have proper early warning services, and we have major gaps in the observing systems in Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific islands, and that's why we have created a financing mechanism called SOF to invest in the basic observing systems. And also our we have some limitations in the understanding of science, for example, how the carbon dioxide and methane are behaving, how are their budgets, and we should also invest in better understanding of those issues. But thanks, Simon, for hosting this event and organizing this, and WMO is fully committed to work for mitigation and also adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, for setting that out so clearly. I was going to turn the floor over now to the lady to my right, the Secretary General's Special Representative on DDR and the head of UNDR here in Geneva, Mami Mitsutori. Recently reappointed, I should say. Congratulations. Great to have you sit around.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Manley. And ladies and gentlemen, again, I also feel so great to be talking to real people. It gives you such a different sense of, excitement, urgency, and as much as virtual works, we know that sometimes we do need to meet in person, especially when we're talking about themes such as important as today's. But again, I would like to echo my fellow speakers in expressing my compassion and solidarity, above all, to all the people in Ukraine who suddenly find themselves engulfed by war. This is a disaster. And again, in all disasters, the most vulnerable people suffer the most. And I think, sadly, we're seeing this in Ukraine again. But it is very important to talk about this issue that will stay with us as decades, in spite of all our efforts. And if we don't put a lot of efforts, it will be more than that. During this just 2 months of this year, or 3 months, we have seen already so many extreme weather events all over the world. Like the report says, there is not a single region in the world which is saved from this extreme weather event phenomena. And so again, the words may seem banal, but yes, the report is a stark reminder of how serious our current situation is and how fragile our future is if we do not act now. UNDRR, we are the UN Agency for Disaster Risk Reduction, and of course, as you may know, 90% of major disasters now are related to extreme weather events. So the issue of climate emergency is central to what we do. We went to COP26 in Glasgow with 3 major messages. One was to the need to enhance climate adaptation. Second was to increase support on averting, minimizing, and addressing losses and damages. And the third one was to enhance predictability in financing. Now, all 3, and this is important, needs to be underscored by a full spectrum understanding of risk. If it is not risk informed, none of these will work. And what does that mean? Well, I believe that the Glasgow Climate Pact greatly enhanced these ambitions and also put the risk-informed element into these 3 messages. And we're delighted to see that adaptation and resilience will be taken forward very energetically to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Now, the IPCC report tells us that there are limits to adaptation, as we have heard. But I think, the good thing about this report, well, the whole thing is wonderful in terms of that it is evidence-based, it is clear, and it should really be the basis of our thinking and our policy. I would like to point out that the fact that the report offers solutions and highlights that if we can combine disaster risk reduction with social protection, yes, we can reduce the vulnerability, and yes, we can correct course. I think this is very important, the fact that it does offer solutions in spite of all the dire things that the report tells us. But the report also tells us that there is a danger of maladaptation, and we need to think about how can we avoid it. And here, I believe that the disaster risk reduction aspect comes in. First, we believe that we need to ensure that the national adaptation plans, the NAPs, that they need to consider all risk drivers. What does it mean? Of course, climate risk is what we are looking at centrally, but when these risks are combined, enhanced by poverty, by inequality, by environmental risk, then hazards become tremendous disasters. So in order to avoid maladaptation, the NAPs need to be risk-informed in the sense of looking at all disaster risk reduction measures. And at the same time, the disaster risk reduction national strategies that all member states need to have under the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, evidently, they need to look at climate risk. Sometimes, in many countries, and actually not sometimes, quite often, the authorities that look at climate policy, the authorities that look at disaster risk reduction, they may not be talking to each other as much as you think. And that's when you see silos building up in establishing your adaptation policies and your disaster risk reduction strategies. And as long as you are doing this, you cannot reach sustainable development. So the first way to avoid maladaptation is to combine climate and disaster risk reduction globally, regionally, and at the national level. Now, at the global level, as my dear friend Petri just mentioned, we recently launched the Center of Excellence for Climate and Disaster Resilience. And this is an initiative that already more than 10 UN agencies, including UNDP, UNFCCC, FAO, WFP, have joined. We are going to look at 3 areas. One is how can we combine climate and disaster risk in terms of providing risk knowledge products to member states. Second, how can we combine it for better governance? And third, in the area of early warning and early action that Petri also just mentioned. The second thing that we need to do in order to avoid maladaptation is that we need to really support much better all member states, but especially the member states which are in a very vulnerable situation, including the SIDS and the LDCs. Now, how can we do it? Well, the UK government successfully negotiated that agreement came out to operationalize the Santiago network, which is about enhancing technical support to member states for reducing their losses and damages. And this is crucially important. We do need to find best ways to start this network, Santiago network, to work, bringing together all the knowledge and experience within the UN system, but beyond, so that further losses and damages will not, well, they will happen, but they can be reduced as much as possible. And I think right now we are in this very important process, and this needs to be launched at COP27. The third way to avoid maladaptation is financing. The big, gigantic missing piece is climate and disaster risk financing. There is just not enough money going into climate financing and disaster risk reduction financing, while many countries urgently need investment in this area. So we need to, as again many people said, build on the agreement that was reached at Glasgow to finance for climate change adaptation, double that. And we need to recognize that each dollar that is withheld is someone's life on the line. Now, that is not enough, I must say. It's also important how we reach the 100 billion climate finance with 50% going to mitigation and 50% to adaptation. The how is also important. So first, we need to require that ODA, governments and banks only invest in sustainable infrastructure that is climate resilient and in line with a low carbon future. Second, companies need to comprehensively report their climate exposure, not only in their terms of their contribution to global emission, but also in terms of the risk in their portfolios based on negative climate change impact. And thirdly, we need to very urgently create a new market structure to finance the climate transition in developing countries. And we need to incentivize climate resilient investment through structures including green bonds and preferential financing. Now, I'd like to conclude by saying that Jagan said that we need to keep the dialogue going. So we have COP26, we have COP27. In between, in May in Bali, the Indonesian government is going to host the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is the once in 3 years big conference for disaster risk reduction. The last one was hosted in Switzerland, in Geneva here 3 years ago. There will be a lot of focus on climate. There will be a ministerial roundtable around climate, and there will be, importantly, not only governments, which are of course the main actors for disaster risk reduction, but also non-governmental stakeholders all coming together to discuss about, among other things, the synergy between climate and disaster risk reduction. So we sincerely hope that this can be a bridge between Glasgow and Sharm el-Sheikh for building resilience and helping us getting out from this vicious circle of disaster, destruction, response, recovery, and then disaster again. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Mami, for that and for your very sort of clear, practical suggestions about how we can address this through your work. One of the most influential voices in Glasgow, of course, was the voice of the Secretary General. Sorry, I've got notes are out of order. Get that. Getting ahead of myself. Sorry. I wanted to turn now to Rupa Mukherjee, who's the Director of Advisory Services at Helvetis, one of the lead authors at the IPCC. We've heard a lot of reaction here this afternoon, Rupa, to the report. When you listen to that and when you look at the report, who should we, whether it be governments, NGOs, or society, be focusing on in our efforts, given the findings of this latest report?
Thank you, Ambassador, for this opportunity at a very difficult and painful time that we are going through. Many thanks also to the previous speakers for acknowledging the work of myself and my 269 colleagues as lead authors who have contributed our time voluntary over the last 4 years under very difficult working and collaboration conditions with COVID setting the frame. I think a big step that was taken in this assessment and the report was the use of an integrative and holistic approach to assess vulnerability and climate risks. So the report highlights certain global hotspots where overlapping challenges such as high levels of poverty, limited access to basic services, weak leadership, weaker governance, reduced trust in government combined to heighten vulnerability including to climate change. And this is how climate change impacts are felt. They combine with existing vulnerabilities and affect communities who have low development levels, the first and the highest. This is manifested in the fact that the loss of lives from floods, droughts, and storms in the last decade has been 15 times higher in these hotspots than in more resilient countries. Currently, 3.3 billion people across Central and South America, Africa, South Asia, small island developing states, and the Arctic are considered highly vulnerable to climate change. Half the world's population already experiences water insecurity for at least a month each year due to climate combining with other factors. So these are the hotspots we should be very conscious about in targeting our interventions. Above 1.5 degree warming, lack of fresh water could mean that people living in small islands and those dependent on glacier and snowmelt can no longer adapt. So the report really assesses adaptation options and limits to adaptation with different degrees of warming. And it highlights that these regions could experience a 50% decline in water supply for agriculture and hydropower, which is actually one of the very important mitigation measures. Climate change will also increasingly undermine food security. We depend on a small range of crops that have been bred specifically for very precise temperature and moisture levels, precipitation. So by 2 degree warming, yields of multiple staple crops in some current growing areas will be very adversely affected. People in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Central America, and small island states are likely to experience food shortages leading to malnutrition. Globally, more than 1 billion people living in low-lying cities and other settlements on the coast, including on small islands, are projected to be at risk of sea level rise and other climate hazards by 2050. The report clearly presents that children born today are likely to experience a very different climate by the time they are adults, and the time horizons for action get shorter and shorter. This assessment also highlights that action on adaptation has been increased, but the progress remains uneven. As the previous speaker said, there is a huge fragmentation of adaptation actions, and current actions are often inadequate to deal with current levels of warming. So we are hardly prepared to deal with the warming that is inbuilt into the system and we are likely to experience by 2040. The gaps between adaptation needs and actions are widening, especially in lower income countries, affecting populations who are already vulnerable and have limited capacities. So in answer to your question, future vulnerability will also be concentrated in places where the capacity of governments, communities, and the private sector to provide basic services is constrained. And as development DRR actors, we should be particularly attentive to these needs. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, Rupa, for that. As I was about to say when I was about to introduce the wrong person to speak, one of the most influential voices back in Glasgow, and indeed lead up to Glasgow, and then since then in his addresses to the General Assembly has of course been the UN Secretary General, and we're very honoured to have with us here this afternoon his Special Advisor on Climate Action, Selwyn Hart. Selwyn, as you kind of listen to the debate this afternoon, how confident are you that this adaptation financing gap is being addressed, and kind of what do you take away from what you've heard this afternoon more generally?
Thank you so much, Simon, and certainly a pleasure to join all of you and to see so many familiar faces of colleagues and friends. I'm so sorry that I could be with you in Geneva. But thanks to the work of the IPCC over the past 3.5 decades, a lack of scientific understanding of the consequences of inaction or insufficient action to address the climate crisis is no longer a legitimate excuse. And based on what I've heard today and what we've read in the report, we are now at a critical moment. We are simply running out of time to reverse course and prevent the worst impacts of the climate crisis. The good news is that we now know with certainty what needs to be done and over what time frame, and what are the critical thresholds we dare not cross. So from all that I've heard and from what I've seen in this report, we have two urgent, and let me stress urgent, tasks ahead of us. First, we must reduce emissions in line with the 1.5-degree goal. And second, we must invest in adaptation and resilience to save and protect lives and livelihoods. This report has shown that the frequency and intensity of climate impacts are accelerating at just 1.1 to 1.2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, and previews further catastrophe for humanity and the planet if we breach the 1.5-degree goal. Science tells us that this will require the world to cut emissions by 45% below 2010 levels by 2030. But according to the current commitments that were submitted at Glasgow, global emissions are set to increase by almost 14% during this decade. So by any measure, the world is way off course. G20 nations account for 80% of global emissions, and their leadership is needed more than ever. As the Secretary General has said, coal and other fossil fuels are choking humanity. We know that ending coal in OECD countries by 2030 and before 2040 in the rest of the world is the single most important step that can be taken to keep 1.5 alive. We know that given the pressing development priorities of developing countries, they will require financial and technological support to accelerate their transition away from coal and other fossil fuels to renewable energy. And this is why the Secretary General continues to call for developed countries, MDBs, private financiers, and others to form coalitions to help emerging economies to end the use of coal. And these targeted mechanisms of support would be over and above existing sustainable development needs. Now, our second urgent action must be to give adaptation and resilience support the same priority accorded to mitigation. And after close to 3 decades of intergovernmental negotiations on climate, adaptation finance received just a mere 25%, or 20 billion of total climate finance in 2019. This report clearly illustrates that a lack of support for adaptation is already costing lives in vulnerable regions and communities. If you are living in one of the global hotspots identified in this report, all in the developing world, I must add, you are 15 times more likely to die from a climate impact. And despite the major advances that we've made in technologies over the course of the last 3 decades, 1/3 of the world's population is still not covered by early warning systems. And as Professor Tallis said earlier, early warning systems saves lives. So the commitment made in the Glasgow Climate Pact to double adaptation finance, if it is delivered, is a step in the right direction, but it's clearly not enough. So prior to this report, it was estimated, and Ambassador Wael made mention to this earlier, that adaptation needs in the developing world could reach as much as $300 billion a year by 2030. We must also urgently address the challenges faced by vulnerable countries in accessing climate finance. As the Secretary General said earlier this week, sometime last week, that money that cannot be accessed is the same as money not being provided at all. We must therefore pursue with urgency the promises made at Glasgow to remove the obstacles that prevent small island developing states, least developed countries, and other vulnerable countries from getting the finance they desperately need to save lives and livelihoods. And this includes reviewing current and, I dare say, outdated eligibility systems that only focus on per capita income. Colleagues, our window of opportunity to prevent the worst impacts of the climate crisis is almost closed. This was universally expressed by many of the speakers here this morning. And when the next assessment report is finalized in the next 5 to 6 years, we might already be too late if we don't take the required actions now to urgently reduce emissions and invest in adaptation and resilience in the coming years. And this will require transformation of economies and societies and the mobilization of trillions in private and public finance. And it will also require all hands on deck: private finance, public finance, the private sector, civil society, including young people who are increasingly facing an uncertain future. Finally, to the brave and hardworking scientists behind this report and past reports, thanks again for doing your job and for alerting all of us on the threat posed by the climate crisis. Yet again, you've done an amazing job. It is now up to governments to act. That window is closing, but we still have a narrow opportunity to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. Thank you so much, Simon.
Selwyn, thank you very much. Great for those inspiring words, but also, I mean, for the challenge you set us, the reminder of the scale, financial scale of the challenge, and also of the challenge in getting that money to those countries most in need of it. And thank you too for your words about coal. I don't think the UK at least needs any convincing on that score, and perhaps one of the few positives that can come out of the ghastly situation that we're in Ukraine, maybe to strengthen everybody's resolve to lessen our dependence on fossil fuels. So, moving on, last but far from least on our list, I have great pleasure in handing the floor to Nikki Reich, Director of the Climate and Energy Programme at the Centre for International Environmental Law. Nikki, look forward to hearing you, particularly on the kind of role that sort of civil society can play building on this report.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, good morning to all listening in different parts of the world. Your Excellencies and distinguished guests, it's really a pleasure and an opportunity to take part in this critical discussion. I'm joining here from Washington, D.C., and although virtual, I share many of the sentiments expressed in the room. And I wanted to echo, first and foremost, the difficulty of having this conversation about the climate emergency without acknowledging, as others have, the escalating emergency, another escalating emergency, the war raging in Ukraine. And I wanted to echo a point, in fact, that you've just made in passing me the mic, and that is that the war in Ukraine is a tragic reminder of the intersections between fossil fuel resources and violent conflict, and of the urgent need to end the world's reliance not just on coal, but on oil and gas, on all fossil fuels. Doing so is necessary for peace and for the planet. I wanted to make a few remarks about key warnings from this latest IPCC report that echo messages civil society, local communities, and indigenous peoples have been sounding the alarm about for years, and also some welcome acknowledgements in this report about the central role of justice, equity, and inclusive governance in effective climate action on adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. And these are all observations and messages that must give rise to concrete action between now and COP27 and well beyond. I want to start first and foremost with a critical point that the IPCC made in this report, and that is that overshoot poses grave dangers, unleashing impacts irreversible on timescales from centuries to millennia, and in some cases, such as with species loss, simply irreversible. The knowledge that surpassing 1.5 degrees Celsius, even temporarily, will cause irreversible damage to human and natural systems, including loss of life, land, ice, entire ecosystems, and the livelihoods that depend on them, and thwarting adaptation must give rise to science-based mitigation measures, policy responses that are designed to avoid overshoot through immediate action to reduce emissions this decade, including through an immediate halt to oil and gas expansion and a phase out of the production and use of all fossil fuels. As has been said, this decade is decisive, not just for those emissions reductions and mitigation measures, but for adaptation as well. Near-term action is simply essential to avoid the additional loss and damage that would ensue if warning of 1.5 is reached, and the irreparable harm that would be unleashed by overshooting. It's important that, as the IPCC recognized in this report, to note that responses to climate change can themselves introduce risks. And policy choices that would lock the world into overshooting 1.5 degrees and gambling on return, rather than immediately and drastically slashing emissions, invite permanent loss and irreparable damage and are simply indefensible. Technological approaches deployed to purportedly reverse or mask overshoot, such as solar radiation modification or carbon dioxide removal, could not only prove ineffective, but further risk additional harm and disaster, such as rainfall disruption, termination shock, and erosion of human and ecological resilience. These points that are made in the IPCC's report just underscore the absolute imperative to prioritize near-term reductions and actions that will avoid as much as possible reaching or exceeding 1.5 and not to rely on risky technologies. The second point I wanted to underscore is one that civil society is very invested in and has been made by other speakers, and I welcome that, is the absolute necessity for delivering on action on loss and damage. And that action needs to take the form of financing, moving beyond dialogue, but actually committing to finance the communities, the most vulnerable, that are least responsible for the current crisis and hardest hit. You know, this latest IPCC report affirms that governments are failing populations least responsible, and that redress for those harms is not just a moral imperative, but it's an obligation under international law, as civil society has been said, and long overdue. And it really should provide a light of fire under states going into COP27 to move beyond what was agreed in Glasgow and summon the courage to deliver funding for loss and damage while phasing out fossil fuels to prevent global temperature rise from exceeding 1.5 degrees. And finally, I wanted to come to the critical recognition that is reflected in this report about the central necessity, really, of inclusive decision-making on climate, centering equity, justice, indigenous peoples, and traditional knowledge in climate action. This report, for perhaps more than any prior report, acknowledges that participation and those sources of knowledge and engagement in locally driven climate action are necessary for effective adaptation and climate resilient development. And it's imperative from the perspective of civil society that public participation be addressed effectively, both in the process leading up to the COP and during the COP, through meaningful engagement of civil society and indigenous peoples, and in the decisions that are adopted there and throughout this year that really need to provide strong mandates to support and enhance community-based and participatory responses to adaptation and loss and damage, which the IPCC has made unequivocally clear are essential for effective climate action and justice. And so we look forward to working together with governments, with other members of civil society and the private sector to actually realizing the near-term immediate efforts needed to avoid overshoot and to center human rights and people-based solutions, without which no effective climate action is possible. Thank you very much.
Nikki, thank you. And look, thank you for speaking with such passion as well about these issues and reminding us of the crucial kind of importance of justice in all of this. So thank you for that. I was now going to kind of open up, before turning back to our panelists before we close, I was going to actually open up now to questions in the room or indeed online. We have one very specific question that's come in online from Nancy Marangu, which is about whether there is specific climate finance allocated to persons with disabilities, given their vulnerability to climate change. I'd like to come back to that kind of when we perhaps hear from other comments in the room as well. Is anybody here, amongst, as everybody said, nice it is to look out and actually see an audience. How many times over the last year and a half I looked out to an empty audience and pretended that I'm actually speaking to somebody and never quite sure whether there is anybody out there. But I can see you're all out there. And how much taller you look when you're actually not on Zoom. It's extraordinary. Questions in the room. I have several. I have 3, 4, 5. My goodness, it's like an auction here. I'm going to start, just because he's a very distinguished gentleman, at the back with Paul Beckers, the permanent representative of the Netherlands. Since I won't know everybody else, it's probably helpful if, as we go to others, if you could say who you are and kind of which organisation you are, and try and keep the questions brief, Ambassador, and then we can kind of come back to any responses from the panel. Paul, the floor's yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Dear Simon, it's okay to give. Does it need to be a question, or can I give a reflection?
You can reflect and question as you wish. This at least is a free space.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. No, first of all, thank you for bringing us together on this important topic that really needs and deserves all the attention that that is required. And under these difficult circumstances, there might be a risk that we do not give it proper attention. And I'd like to comment on the IPCC for its very good and important work. And I thank the august panel. I listened carefully, took a lot of notes, actually, be it on Mr. Archie Young talking about science comes first, or on Mr. Chapagain's plea for action on the ground and the need for mental change of government, as Mr. Talas was mentioning. And I liked what Mrs. Misatori was explaining on the risk of maladaptation. Very useful. Mr. Hart, when he was arguing for the need to decrease fossil fuel, yes, I would like to add, though, which is closely followed, but the need to decrease, reduce livestock, because the impact of that is tremendous, as it sometimes is overlooked. 2 points, Simon, if I may. First is I wholeheartedly subscribe to all that's being said on adaptation. That is crucial. And indeed, it needs to go hand in hand with mitigation, as Mr. Tala said, and reflecting on, to echo actually on Mr. Alok Sharma, he mentioned, and I quote, failure is inexcusable. And he said, inaction is not an option. I would actually bring them together. I think failure is not an option. And the Netherlands is much aware and takes responsibility on this adaptation issue. In January 21, we saw the Climate Adaptation Summit, which generated global political and financial support. So I have a second point, and that's a little bit of an advertisement, but very important. I'd like to commend Egypt for its leadership on COP27. Not in the least because Egypt acknowledges the importance of water, and Mr. Talas mentioned also the sea level rise and all the risks. And COP27 will be followed by the UN 23 Water Conference in New York, which is co-hosted by the Netherlands and Tajikistan. And I would call on everybody present, and all nations and all people, to be involved. And the conference aims to scale up funding by governments, to scale up and replicate actions and best practices, and thirdly, to share innovations to get the world on track to fulfill SDG 6 and to set an agenda beyond 23. So this is more a call than a question, although any comments from the panel on support, if I may say, for this important conference is welcome. Thank you very much, dear Simon, dear Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I would certainly echo your commendation of our Egyptian colleagues for the way that they're approaching COP27. And indeed, as you said, failure is not an option, nicely put. Now, I had, I think, 3 hands over here and 2 here. I'm going to start, if I may, right at the back. A gentleman in the sort of penultimate row in the yellow top. Sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm from the International Labour Organization. I have two questions. The first to UK presidency, and the second to Madame on, unfortunately couldn't get the name for disaster risk reduction in the panel. So the first one is about the elephant in the room, which Dr. Thaler pointed out. The climate 2 degree or 1.5 degree target will be solved with G20, notably China and India. And we learned from the media, notably, that last moment you were pressed to change language, notably from these two countries in the Glasgow Accord. And now we know about the Just Transition Pact with South Africa. So I think it's about a political economy. It's about how you get these two countries to commit and to implement the Paris Agreement. So the question is there anything in the making, like the Just Transition Accord with China and India, to help those countries, or politically and on the ground to make that move? And now the second question, it's the same. It's also the elephant in the room. In fact, my village in Germany was half washed away through the floods. It's Erstadt. You have seen it probably in the media, but probably we don't need any assistance in terms of climate adaptation, funding and or planning and or early disaster. But it is about the vulnerable countries, no? So it is kind of a transfer where England spends million more on the Thames River adaptation plan, same as Germany spends. So there's this connect between what developed countries have in terms of adaptability and capacity versus those vulnerable. So there seems to be, to me, yet no solution, even if the funding is doubled and all the talk about it. But now, if Sharm el-Sheikh is about implementation, the question is it just talk, or is there really something in the making which would make it different in the future? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like Archie to come back, actually. I'm going to try and take all these questions and kind of comments together as kind of quickly as we can. And then I'd like to come back to people far more experts than me to try and answer them. And I'd particularly like Archie to pick up the comments about India and China there, but others may have points they want to add. I'm going to take one person online, just because this is a permanent representative for all that kind of, you can circumvent. And we have my Slovene colleague, Anita Pipan, who's joined us online. Anita, do you want to come in now? And then I'm going to come back to the others in the room who've got questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon, for giving me the floor. And it is indeed important that we take time to reflect on the IPCC findings and have this critical discussion. And I also join you in expressing solidarity with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people whose human rights have been egregiously violated as we speak. I wanted to add to what Professor Thaler and our Dutch colleague Paul have talked about, namely the impacts of, namely water, and I want to focus on impacts of climate change on water resources. As water is the primary medium through which we feel the effects of climate change, I would like to bring to us some areas of actions in this area, and maybe later hear the panelists comment on them. One is to integrate water and climate agendas, both at national level and through transboundary water cooperation and management, to adopt nature-based solutions as part of adaptation, resilience, and mitigation efforts also in the water sector. 3, to ensure open access to reliable data on climate and water that can inform effective policy. And in our opinion, we also need the UN Special Envoy for Water. Last but not least, something that UK is doing as we speak, we need strong cooperation among actors also here in international Geneva to help further promote the water climate nexus. In this regard, I'd like to express our support for WMO's Water and Climate Coalition, and also thank the COP26 presidency, the UK, and welcome COP27 presidency, Egypt, Egypt's efforts to give water and climate nexus the space and visibility it deserves at the UN climate conferences. I thank you.
Anita, thank you very much. Look, I can see this Dutch-Slavian alliance here on water, but let's we'll pick up these comments about water, not least, I'm sure the Secretary General wants to say a word. You very kindly kind of referenced the work that the WMO is leading on this and the coalition they've formed. I'm going to come back to the room now, and I'm going to turn to the gentleman who's directly in my line of sight between me and the Dutch ambassador. If you'd like to introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much also for holding this event and bringing together all these different perspectives. I would like to pick up a point that was made by the Egyptian speaker, and that was the importance of trust in achieving, especially implementation, but also achieving what is necessary to achieve the 1.5 degree target. And one question that arises to me is, how will the COP27 presidency ensure that there is a more fair balance among stakeholders, especially given the overrepresentation of fossil fuel companies at COP26, which which rose very substantial doubts with climate activists, with most vulnerable countries, and many people in the climate community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's another question I've marked down. Well, I have a combination of Archie and the Egyptian ambassador on that one, but let's come back to a very specific question there about fossil fuel producers. Now, I'm turning to the left now, and I'm going to come back to you, sir, in a second. And a couple of questions on the left here. The lady at the back, and then the gentleman closer to the front. If you, exactly, you. Want to introduce yourself first, and then ask your question or make your comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Vanessa Erok-Bogbo from the International Trade Center. Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. It's clear that we need all hands on deck to address the climate crisis, even hands on deck that we don't traditionally think of as being part of the solution. For small businesses, for smallholder farmers in vulnerable countries, international trade is critical for assisting them build their resilience, for accessing technologies for adaptation, and so on. My question is, how do the COP presidencies, both the current and incoming, see the role of trade in climate action?
Thank you very much. Lady who runs some of the very best programs, the ITC, I have to say as well. Gentleman here on the left.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm Mustafa Kamal, Global Coordinator for Green Jobs at the International Labour Office. I think climate adaptation is fundamental, but what it means is that workers will have to develop new skills, and sometimes they will even need to enter new occupations. And it will mean that enterprises, like in the tourism industry, have to operate differently. They will have to find new ways to ensure occupational safety and health in the context of heat stress. And this means that social policy, including social security, has an important role, both in mitigation and adaptation. And I think this is why at the COP27, with the UK COP presidency, there was this declaration on just transition, which was an important document. And this is also why last September, the UN Secretary General hosted a meeting and has in his common agenda an initiative on called the Global Accelerator for Jobs and Social Protection for a Just Transition. So therefore, we're trying to find ways to better align climate policies, both mitigation and adaptation, with social policies and a just transition. But at the moment, there is a gap. None of the existing funding mechanisms makes it possible to deal with those social policies, reskilling of the workforce, supporting enterprises. So I just put this question of what could be done more to align climate policies with social policies that I mentioned, occupational safety and health, social security, and making the workforce fit for the climate needs of today and the future. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, no, very good question about the just transition. Then yes, gentleman, sort of situated just to the left of Dr. Maston.
Thank you very much, Excellency, and thank you for convening this event. I have, in fact, two questions to the panelists. Would you like to tell us, because I am a diplomat, so I am from Mission of Algeria, so I have, at least for me, the technical background to discuss these very high technical but also political issues, of course. Could you tell us some concrete examples of maladaptations solutions which have been or are being implemented, especially in developing countries? Secondly, I would like to raise the issue of the nexus between climate change and security, especially in the two most affected regions in the world by climate change, which are Africa and the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody else who wanted to ask a question? Yeah, I have two more questions. Excellent. Right. The lady on the far left, and then I'm going to come back to the gentleman here on the right.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm here on behalf of UN Women. And of course, tomorrow is International Women's Day, and the theme this year is very much related to this discussion because it's gender equality today for a sustainable tomorrow. And the theme was actually chosen because this year's Commission on the Status of Women, which is the primary UN body for gender equality and the empowerment of women, has as well its theme this year on climate change, the environment, and disaster risk reduction. So I thought it might be useful to maybe share some of the insights from the Commission on the Status of Women this year and the main messages coming out of the SDGs report because they're highly relevant to this discussion. So the main recommendations are actually to systematically integrate gender perspectives into policies and programs on the climate change, the environment, and disaster risk reduction.
Remove the plastic. It's a bit hard to hear.
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
Just remove the plastic.
Okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure it was allowed. So I'll repeat that. The first recommendation coming out from the Commission on the Status of Women is to systematically integrate gender perspectives into policies and programs on climate change, the environment, and disaster risk reduction. The second is to promote the leadership of women. The third is to strengthen the capacities of women and women's organizations to build climate, environmental, and disaster resilience. The fourth is to look at increasing gender responsive finance, including for women's organizations and their communities. The fifth is to look at gender disaggregated statistics in the gender environment nexus. And then there are also recommendations looking at the increase of gender-based violence and the increased insecurity of women and girls in the context of climatic impacts and displacement. And so I thought it was useful to share those recommendations in this forum. And of course, they're highly relevant to what we've been hearing today about the need to double adaptation funds and also the global goal on adaptation. And so I do have a question linked to that as well. To what extent does this report look at specific impacts on women and girls? And to what extent in our work around the adaptation funds and the global goal are we taking into account the need for a gender responsive response? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have one more question, which is an online question, I think, actually. Sorry, then I'm going to, first I'm going to turn to the gentleman here, and then the lady in the middle, and then I suspect we might have to, sorry, I'm going to have three more questions in the room. You're going to have to be very brief. So the gentleman here, then the lady in the middle, and then the gentleman to the left, and I have one question online as well, and then I'm going to turn back to my panel, who are going to be remarkably succinct in their answers and their conclusions. So.
This way. Sorry. Janos Pastor, I'm the Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. And I wanted to thank Nikki Wright for raising the issue of overshoot and the absolute importance in not overshooting. And yet, the signals that I'm hearing from all of you and the Working Group 1 report and elsewhere is that there is actually a fairly reasonable possibility that the world will overshoot. So my question is that in addition to the absolute necessity of short-term immediate emission reductions and the adaptation measures you've talked about, shouldn't the world start talking seriously about how to manage the overshoot? Something to start discussing, because it may be too late if we start in 5-10 years from now. Thank you.
Good question. Thank you very much. I'm going to jump to the left and then back to the middle. Gentleman on the left.
Jean-Christophe Bardwell, Association of PPP Units. I'm the Executive Director. I very much liked what Ms. Mami Matutari told us about the gigantic gap that we find here today with financing. And obviously, private sector will have to step up, and pension funds also come in. Unfortunately, many countries don't have proper public-private partnership legislation. Even though it's one of the, 1717-1, the target of partnerships. And so my question was, what specifically can we do to create this multi-stakeholder collaboration? I mean, the WAP, as the World Association of PPP Units, it stands ready to do that, but so far we're seeing very little support technically with the PPP units that are our members in the world, how to actually implement that. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. And then the lady in the middle, and then I'm going to read out my one online question, and then I'm going to, I hope that my colleagues here on the panel have been scribbling away all the way through this, and I'm going to pick up some of these questions and comments in concluding this event. Please.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm Shefali Nandra, a master's student at the Graduate Institute here in Geneva. Thank you to our speakers for your really insightful comments today. We've heard a lot about the need to act now, and I hear it a lot in my own personal research as well, as do my colleagues. How can we hope, though, to implement climate governance so quickly when working within something like a year's time frame, specifically between COP27 and COP26? And beyond that, if we look towards Agenda 2030, that's only 8 years away. And so how can we hope to implement government techniques and practices when everything is changing so quickly? And of course, we have a lot of states internationally who are also behind the curve. And there is very much a disparity between what needs to be done and those involved. And off the back of that, with such a short time frame in mind, we have a very significant group of young people, youth climate activists and enthusiasts and researchers who wish to be heard, listened to, make a difference. And so I'd love to hear your opinions on how those people can get involved from a government and implementation perspective. Thank you very much.
Really good question about governance and participation of young people. And I'm going to look to that, I have to say, again, to combination of Ochi and Ambassador Magad in Cairo. Now, this may not work, but I'm going to try and start in kind of reverse order. So I'm going to go first back to Nikki. But just before we do, I've got one question, which I suspect, Dagan, is for you, or at least you may be the best placed person on this panel to answer it, which is from Sarah at PPD, who asks, the UN Secretary General is preparing his action agenda on internal displacement based on the report and recommendations of the high-level panel. Which recommendations from science do we have in the IPCC report? And what should the organisations, countries represented on the panel be doing differently or more of to avert, minimise and address displacement in the context of disasters and climate change? Actually, I realise that could be either for you or it could be for Mami. So, okay, try and pick it up as we go through. Now, my panellists are going to have to be
concise and to the point. But we've got a number of really good questions and comments there, ranging from how we embed green jobs in the sort of the just transition, the relationship between climate and security. Okay, might be one for you. Water and climate. I think, Secretary General, that's a definite one for you. The gender perspective in the IPCC report and more broadly, and last one, about how we sort of shift climate governance, and particularly ensuring a role for young people as we meet these really tight deadlines. So, starting, I hope, with Nikki. Any reactions to those comments and questions, but also kind of anything in particular, Nikki, that you want to take away from this discussion this afternoon?
Well, thank you. I mean, those questions were tremendously wide-ranging, and there's far more on the table than is possible to address in a short time frame. I did want to really echo and applaud the speaker who raised up the importance of gender equality and gender responsive approaches to addressing climate change, which I think is something this report does address and is critical going forward, not just for this year, but in decades ahead. With regard to the comment that was made about overshoot, I do want to just stress that there is tremendous uncertainty, as this report makes clear, around the possibility of returning temperature levels, and that the technologies that are purported and relied on in overshoot scenarios to do so carry with them new and significant social and environmental risks. And so the emphasis really needs to be right now on going as far and as fast as possible in slashing emissions from fossil fuels and from deforestation driven by agro-industry, because there's a tremendous opportunity cost in counting on or in investing dollars needed to make that rapid energy transition and to ensure labor transition as well, as one of the other questions and speakers mentioned, and to support that just and equitable transition today, and not actually sinking those otherwise scarce dollars, as we know from the financing gap, into unproven at that scale and risky technologies, when we know that there are surefire ways to rapidly draw down and cut emissions through a decrease in reliance on fossil fuels and through halting deforestation driven by agro-industry. So I really would also just echo that going into the COP, that ensuring equitable access for civil society, indigenous peoples, and local communities is going to enhance the actions we take today, and that those actions and the implementation of them at the local and national levels is going to ensure the kind of resilience to not only make that accelerated transition possible, but also ensure that rights are protected in the responses adopted to the climate catastrophe. Thank you.
Okay, fabulous. What about that? Concision, precision, passion. Thank you very much for responding to so many of the questions and comments we've had here this afternoon. Someone, are you still with us? I think you would particularly like to pick up, but in terms of climate and security, I was wondering.
Thank you so much, Simon, and I will try to be as concise as possible and to touch on some of the questions that have been raised. And yes, we need to do all of the above. Colleagues made many of the questions focus on very narrow thematic issues, but we need to do all of the above. But if we do not get the world off of its addiction to coal, and yes, I agree, other fossil fuels over the course of the next decade, we have zero chance of keeping 1.5 alive. And if we don't keep 1.5 alive, the impacts that we will see will be significantly worse than what they currently are projected to be. So keeping 1.5 alive, ensuring that the single most important step that can be taken to do that, which is getting the world off of coal and getting emerging developing countries towards a renewable energy future, that needs to be our urgent priority. It will require massive amounts of private finance. It's estimated that it will cost about an additional $1 trillion a year in new investments. That new investment needs to come primarily from the private sector. At present, only 3% of investments held by institutional investors in Europe and 1% in the United States are invested in the emerging economies. Now, so what needs to be done is really redirecting those trillions of dollars, hundreds of billions to trillions, towards the types of investments that are required in these large emerging economies. And the second is on adaptation and resilience. As this report clearly illustrates, if you're living in Central America, South America, small island developing states, East, Central, or Southern Africa, the Arctic, SIDS, etc., or South Asia, you're 15 times more likely to die from a climate impact. Right? So we really need to get resources at pace and scale to these countries to support building adaptation and resilience in vulnerable peoples and communities. And of course, private finance will need to be leveraged over time, but in the immediate future, the bulk of it will be public finance. And we need to acknowledge that the bulk of the immediate resources that will support adaptation and resilience in vulnerable countries will need to come from the public sector, while of course we work over time to leverage greater levels of private finance to support adaptation and resilience. And finally, I believe that we can do it. We cannot give up hope. We look forward to continuing to work with all of you. It truly requires all hands on deck, but we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Wen, for that. Both a sense of challenge, but also that positive spirit. Thank you. If you're still with us, can I turn to you and perhaps particularly to pick up the point about gender perspectives in the report? You still with us? Not sure. We will perhaps come back to Rupert in a second if we can. Mami, do you want to?
Yes. Very briefly, because we're running out of time. But so first, gender responsive climate policy, disaster risk reduction, environmental policy. Thank you for raising it. The recommendations are all important. For me, women's leadership in these policies is really important. Don't look at these people as people who should be protected only. They should be the ones who are part of the policy making. So the leadership is very important. In terms of the question about the adaptation cost, so the problem is not only in developing countries where not enough climate financing for adaptation goes in, but also in developed countries, when you look at the budget, there is not a large amount of money that goes into prevention in both like adaptation or disaster risk reduction. And this is because we still look at this as a cost, not an investment. So unless we change our mindset that investing into adaptation, disaster risk reduction is an investment and not a cost, this will not change. And definitely we need to do that in both ODA, but in the domestic budget as well. My other comment would be definitely, as the gentleman mentioned, the public-private partnership is crucial. By 2040, I think $90 trillion will be invested into infrastructure, of which 80% is going to come from the private sector. So if the private sector money does not go into resilient infrastructure, then infrastructure will not be resilient. The problem is there still is not a global standard about what is resilient infrastructure. So we do need to, while making this partnership, find a way to devise, what is global resilient infrastructure, and also we need to find a way to measure resilience, which is still not there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I saw Rupert join us. Rupert, you still there?
Yes, I'm still here. Apologies, I missed, I did not hear the question earlier on gender. I just wanted to share that there is a very important cross-chapter paper in chapter 18, where we have, as the earlier speaker said, not only looked at the differential gender impacts, but also the knowledge that women bring to the question of adaptation and risk reduction. There was a question also about maladaptation and what are possible examples. So from our assessment, we found that 60% of adaptation responses that we see in the countries, deal with water. And some of them are also maladaptive in nature. So one example would be building flood walls, protective walls, hard infrastructure, which can give a false sense of security, drawing in populations into areas where the risks can increase, can be modified also because of climate change. So they become a source of enhancing risk rather than protection. Another example would be investments in irrigation without taking adequate cognizance of the changing precipitation patterns. So again, they promote practices that are not resilient in the midterm. And yeah, with this, I'll hand over back to you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to turn to the Secretary General now. There's a word about water and climate.
Yeah, thanks for raising this water-climate nexus. We are going to have tomorrow high-level panel in this building with the heads of state and former heads of state and ministers. We have 10 UN agencies behind an initiative that we would like to give a boost to global water management systems and related services. And we are very grateful for Netherlands for this adaptation panel work, and I was happy to contribute. And I think that we will meet this week. We can debate the issue a little bit further. Then this India, China, and perhaps this BRICS question is also a hot topic when it comes to mitigation. And one should also keep in mind that, for example, India, China, Brazil, and South Africa, and also Russia, they are very sensitive to changes or impacts of climate change. We have low-lying areas in China and India. They are suffering because of poor air quality. South Africa and Brazil are, it seems that they will have more severe drought problems. So they have very good reasons, and also this Himalayan glacier melting is a big issue. So they have very good reasons, even from the national perspective, to be part of the adaptation front. And this flooding challenge that you were raising, that's demonstrating that at the national level, it's important that the meteorological and hydrological organizations are working together, and because of this lack of cooperation, we saw so many casualties in Germany. And by the way, it wouldn't have been possible without the impact of climate change. That's already demonstrated. And what else? The social science, social nexus is also important. We have seen this Gilets jaunes, yellow vest movement in France 3 years ago, when the fuel price was, there was a proposal to enhance the tax a bit, and that led to demonstrations. And so this is a sensitive issue, and especially keeping in mind the high energy prices today, the policymakers have to be very careful how to proceed in that respect. And the colleague from Algeria, this security nexus is clear. We saw the Arab Spring some years ago, and there was severe drought as one factor behind this unrest in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Syria. And this is demonstrating that also the security issue is important, and the risks are growing at the moment. And finally, this gender issue, there one dimension could be this population growth control. We will see more victims of climate change, and we will see also more consumers if we continue the current path. Especially Africa is very vulnerable from that perspective. Thank you.
Secretary General, thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Jagan first, and then we're going to close with our two sort of UK and Egyptian sort of negotiators. Jagan.
Thank you, Simon. Maybe very briefly, the comment made on disability funding and the gender perspective, I think I fully agree with those comments, and I think they will really help us when we are further strengthening our climate action. So I want to thank the colleagues who made those comments. On the internal displacement, it was a very interesting question, because we did a study last year, and what we found was actually the climate-related displacement is 3 times higher than the conflict-related displacement. Of course, now the Ukraine situation might change that number. But until last year, 3 times more people were displaced by climate-related events than by the conflict. So this is a major issue. And the climate-related displacement happens generally internally. So it doesn't become a big news because they are not crossing international borders. So this is a very, very pertinent question. Now, there are a few things that needs to be done. One is, of course, the locally led climate action is very important. And if the climate resilience is done with the local participation, you actually prevent the displacement in the first place. But also, if there is a displacement happening, if the local community is empowered, the suffering of the people becomes less because you have developed a coping mechanism from the local community level. So that's why I cannot overemphasize the need of involvement of the local communities in the climate resilience. It's extremely important. The second aspect is, and I think the IPCC reports also highlights that, the climate adaptation action would not be successful without addressing the root causes of inequalities. And that means, we have to have a much broader aspect, much broader angle to look into addressing the adaptation issues. So I think somebody was making a comment around the jobs and the social protection measures. These are important elements of actually addressing the inequality, the root causes of inequality, which actually helps succeed the adaptation. And my final comment I wanted to make on the youth participation, and I just wanted to highlight that, for the Red Cross and Crescent, more than 60% of our volunteers are young people, and they are actually involved on this climate action. I was mentioning, Archie, that my ambition is to create a community-level movement of young activists to really change from the climate talk to climate action. And I just want to add, finish by repeating what Alok said, and I really loved it, and I wrote it here. The future is not yet written, and I really like that, and especially with the questions around the young people. Looking at the engagement of the young activists, the way they are committing to really involve themselves, but also push the leadership to change. I do believe that we can turn this course, and we can make sure that the future is not yet written. We can take the different course of the future of the climate action. So really wanted to thank you for that question, because we need that message of hope also, not only the message of doom and gloom. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Thank you very much, Sharon. I'm going to turn first to Ambassador Abdelmoud in Cairo, who's been very patiently waiting for us. Ambassador, do you want to pick up any of those points, particularly about kind of how we're going to deal with some of these issues in Sharm el-Sheikh?
Thank you very much, and I sympathize with your struggle with my last name. It's Wael Abdelmoud.
Sorry.
His name. But moving forward as fast as I can on a number of issues, this has been a very enriching and rich, in fact, conversation about a number of issues. I scribbled some points down to respond to. Hopefully, I'll try to cover as many as I can. First and foremost, we're all praising the Working Group 2 report, and I can assure you that we hope, as we've all emphasized, the importance of science and fact being the foundation of our work, that as we move forward on the number of issues that are high on the agenda of COP27, particularly with regard to the GGA, the Santiago Network, finance, definition of finance, the new quantified collective goal post-2025, all of those issues, this report and other scientific contributions, fact-based contributions, will be and should be the foundation of all of our work, not just as presidency. We're neutral, we're trying to bring parties together, and I'll address the issue of trust that was mentioned earlier at the last part of my intervention right now. So that's going to be the foundation of our work, and I hope that everyone will go along and base it not just based on national interests. Of course, they have to be on the table, but also science and fact have to be at the center of our work. The second point, I think it was the Secretary General of WMO that referred to COP in Glasgow being the second most successful. Of course, we appreciate and congratulate and salute all of the tremendous work put forward by the UK. We continue to work with them hand in hand as we move forward. But since the emphasis in our minds and the minds of everyone surrounding this very most consequential issue of climate change is about implementation, I again salute Paris and I salute Glasgow. But implementation is the real test. The verdict is out. Until and unless we succeed in seeing the Paris Agreement implemented properly to achieve the 1.5 target, the verdict is out on Paris. Likewise, and I think my colleagues from the UK won't begrudge me if I say that their tremendous work still needs to be materialized in the form of implementation, which takes me to the next point, which is non-state actors and stakeholders. We have just appointed a very prominent Egyptian economist, former VP of the World Bank, Executive Director of the IMF, and Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Finance of Sustainable Development Goals, Dr. Mahmoud Mohiuddin, to partner with the very able Nigel Topping, who's been doing a tremendous job in elevating the role of communication and linkage between the intergovernmental process and other processes, the real world that exists outside of the governmental process. And here I have to be very completely honest and brutally frank in this regard. We don't want this to be a going through the motions type of event. The tremendous work being put forward by these two previous and incoming climate champions has to find its way into the intergovernmental process. We're not just ticking boxes and saying we are communicating with you and we're doing, you know, the lip service part of it, but in reality, your voice is not going to be heard. It takes all of the countries, not the presidency, not the current or the incoming presidency, to translate this interaction into real movement on the ground, because it is not necessarily only governments that are going to implement. It is industries, cross-sector, all around the world that have to be brought into the process. And I'll touch on the issue of youth. We've attended already and have organized in Egypt a number of events from all the Mediterranean coast in Alexandria all the way to Aswan and everything in between. We have a very active, proactive, dynamic youth organization support system that's working on this issue and hosting a number of events. We've been mandated by Glasgow to hold a youth platform prior to the COP. So the engagement with youth is essential. The distinguished head of the ICRC made the point about the importance, and I always believe that the future is going to be a little bit better because the youth are more mobilized than we were when we were their age. So we're glad to announce and share with you that we have that engagement with youth, global youth, not just Egyptian, but from all over the world, and they will be very much present. But we really need to take it to the next level to make sure that their voice is at least pressuring government representatives in the negotiating rooms. My next point pertains to the distinguished ambassador from the Netherlands. I think it's an auspicious coincidence that in 2019, in the build-up to the Climate Action Summit of the Secretary General in New York, Egypt and the UK, coincidentally, who are partners now, were partners on the adaptation track, no other. And Netherlands was a very, very prominent ally and member of that group. And we've had the privilege of working with the UK in the past on this issue, and we trust they will continue to play that central role in pushing the adaptation agenda forward as we take over in Sharm el-Sheikh. The issue of finance has been touched upon by many, and I think I can't recall. Oh, it was Selwyn. Thank you very much, Selwyn, for sharing the devastating figures regarding the amount of finance that actually goes to adaptation. I had mentioned some of the numbers, and I am yet to be convinced or someone to demonstrate to me why and how the trillions of private investment will actually go to adaptation. This is not a rhetorical question. I'm really seeking models because we are looking at opportunities and models that will help private investments, because we acknowledge that public money can only go so far. And at the time, for the time being, it is not trickling down to adaptation. It's favoring clearly, as the figures indicated in multiple reports show us, towards mitigation. If you show up with a project for just energy transition, for solar energy or what have you on the mitigation side, it's most likely that you will find funding, plus you will find private investments willing to go there. On the other hand, when you show up, we are devastated by sea level rise in Egypt. 50% of Egypt's population lives in the Delta, and their livelihoods are being devastated. This is an issue of immigration. It could be an issue of economic consequences. And it's very difficult to find funding for an adaptation project. So that's an issue that our finance people need to think creatively and outside of the box to ensure that the livelihoods of people that are being affected, mostly in already underdeveloped countries, are not compounded by the negative impacts of climate change. Last, and there was a gentleman, I think he was directly in your line of sight, Simon, who spoke to the issue of trust. It's been an ongoing theme in Egyptian diplomacy that we realize this is the most consequential challenge of our times. We cannot and will never be in a position to move forward if all we do is say wonderful words about reports such as the one that we're dealing with and reflect empathy in public statements or make general pledges that might not be accountable down the road. This has to translate into positions in the negotiating groups. It is easier said than done. I acknowledge that. But we owe it to the future generations, and it's not a cliche, it is their livelihoods that are at stake here, that we genuinely show empathy. When you show empathy, particularly to developing countries, and they realize that you're doing your best, everyone is doing their best, and everyone is doing their fair share, and there is equity in dealing with the climate challenge, political positions in the negotiating rooms show a little bit more flexibility. I am not naive, and I realize government representatives will exclusively seek their national interests, attempt to reduce commitments that they take upon themselves, and maximize gains potentially from the multilateral process. It's the name of the game. We've all been involved in it for a while. However, this issue is the most consequential of our generation, as we keep saying. And consequently, hopefully, there will be a little bit more listening to each other, appreciation of the predicaments of other countries and the challenges that they confront. And hopefully, we as a chair can provide the format and the avenue, the venue for people to come together and make the necessary difficult concessions. I'll leave it at that. I had an answer to the gentleman on the, I think, the fossil fuel representation. I'm sure that Archie has an excellent answer to it, which I'm pretty much aware of. I'll leave it and back to you, Simon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And look, Ambassador, thank you for your and your government's creativity and commitment and collaboration with us. And I have to say, it would give me no greater pleasure than to be here next year and to hear the Secretary General say that unfortunately Paris has been knocked off top spot and Glasgow pushed into third place by the success of Sharm el-Sheikh. Let's hope for that. Archie.
Thank you. And actually, on that last point, I completely agree, because each COP needs to be more successful than the last. Each one needs to build on the success. This is not some kind of parade. This is actually each one needs to implement, as Wael says, what has been committed to before. But also, we know that even the implementation of what is on the table is still not enough. So each one does still also need to push further, push faster. And that is both through the multilateral process, but also in terms of engaging the full spectrum of community, whether that is industry, young people, women, indigenous peoples, local communities. Everybody needs to be on board. A few specific comments, and I will try to be brief. In terms of the political economy and the fossil fuel at the end of COP26, being here in Geneva, you'll all be very familiar with multilateral processes. The UNFCCC is a consensus-based process. 196 countries need to agree. And so the very fact that we had 200 pages of decisions and guidance agreed by 196 countries, I think demonstrates the collective will to really move forward on all of the issues that we've touched on today. But yes, there are also particular national circumstances which some countries have shown that they have real sensitivities on. I think that when you mention China and India, it's also worth recognizing the real steps that they are taking. For example, China just overtook the UK last year with the world's largest offshore wind capacity. India has committed to 450 gigawatts of renewables. These are seriously impressive achievements. What we need to see is those achievements being articulated in updated nationally determined contributions. We need to see the weaning themselves off fossil fuels, as Selwyn Hart has said, and we need to see that collective ambition from all of us, every single country, being translated into tangible policies, action on the ground. And also it was mentioned about the need to take people with us and the need for a just transition. And you mentioned a just energy transition partnership with South Africa. I think that was a really interesting model. It was specific to the South African context in terms of the organizations involved and the context. But equally, I think there are lessons there in terms of actually how do we get the combination of government, industry, donors, plus also major financial institutions together to actually put bespoke packages together that respond to specific circumstances and crucially highlight the importance of employment, good jobs, real futures for the people whose lives will be affected by the transition. This is a transition of a scale and transformation that we have not seen before, certainly in our generations, if ever before. And so we do need to make sure that as we approach this transition, we take people with us. And that's where I think the trust point Yes, there were a number of voices at COP26. There were actually more civil society representatives at COP26 than any other COP before. And I certainly heard the shouting. And I certainly heard, we met with them every single day. And they, their views were clearly heard. But also they need to be amplified and magnified. And one of the agreements at COP, which I think gets far less attention than it deserves, was a 10-year work program on climate empowerment. And that is actually how do we collectively raise the awareness, the public participation, particularly of youth, the education on matters of climate change, because that is the voice. That is how we are going to really change. As you said, they are the voice of the future, and young people are going to be the ones that hold their parents to account, that hold us to account, and also will be the decision makers for the future. But not just young people, women as well. And there's a paragraph 95 from the Glasgow Climate Pact encourages parties to increase the full and meaningful and equal participation of women in decisions, but also in implementation and means of implementation. And that's the gender responsive finance coming through. And we also made progress on the gender action plan. And I think, we're not wanting in commitments, we're not wanting in statements. It's now all of us. We're doing the homework ourselves in the UK. Actually, how do we make sure that this translates into practical action? And sorry, there's so much more I could say, but I will just finish on the point about timeframes, because you're right. We are talking about really significant action by all acts of society at an incredibly fast pace. Some people complain that when we put the focus on long-term action, that we are somehow, it's an either or, that if you focus on net zero 2050, somehow you're ignoring the short term. Actually, what we need is that clear line of sight. We need everybody to have that clear long-term climate resilient development, whether that is reflected in a net zero goal or carbon neutrality or however that is reflected. Long-term climate adaptation and resilience plans, they're national adaptation plans. We also need those short-term actions now. And that is why we are absolutely giving Wael and his team our full support to make sure that COP27 builds on all the previous agreements and the work beyond countries as well, the work of the high-level champions that involves all parts of society, so that we can get that critical, urgent action, the medium-term new enhanced NDCs, and that long-term view as well. Back to you, Simon.
Archie, thank you, and thank you for kind of picking up so many of the questions and comments from people here and online. I think we may have overrun slightly, but I think what that shows is that even in these dark days when our attention is focused on the plight of the people of Ukraine, there's no diminishing in the commitment from governments, from civil society, from UN and other agencies, from business, from young people, to ensure that we don't just live up to the ambition in Paris and Glasgow, that we build on it in Sharm el-Sheikh. And so thank you for everybody who's been here today. Thank you again, Secretary General, for hosting us. Thank you to the Geneva Environment Network for their support in organising this event. There are, I believe, refreshments outside, by the way. So for those of you who are feeling a little thirsty as a result of your endeavours this afternoon, please do linger with us a while. And just to finish with a reminder of words from the final sentence of the report, which I think has rung so clearly here today. It says that the scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. So there could be no clearer message to all of us, whether we are in government or outside it. Let's ensure that we do indeed take that concerted global action before that window closes forever. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today, wherever you have joined us from. Thank you.